Blah Blah Comics, Blah Blah Curse Words. I'm Derek.
I'm Colby.
And we talk comics sometimes. And not only do we talk comics sometimes we talk about the comics that we love. And, often we talk about comics we love. But this time, we're going a little bit deeper on that idea. So something... I've talked to Colby about this before, and I've posted about this on my personal Facebook page. It's something that's really stuck in my brain. There's literally two comics that everybody, if they haven't read them, they know they're supposed to read them. Everybody knows Dark Knight Returns, and everybody knows Watchmen. And you know what, man? I'm going to be completely blunt, honest with you. I am fucking sick and tired of talking about Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. I don't know about you.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've been doing this podcast now for several years, and there are 3 or 4
and we've been
books.
Nerds for several years.
Oh, yeah. And there's so many books that we love to talk about, but so many times in comics, people always bring it back to the same 4 or 5 books. And, I mean, yes, for good reason. Watchmen redefined the genre. Dark Knight added so much more depth than what we were used to, and a new entire layer to the genre. We get that. That's awesome. They did incredible things. But those are 2 books that came out even those years that came out were full of incredible books. And since then, people like to harken back at the nostalgia of those books. They like to harken back at just those, where we're a group of people that love looking at things that people don't always pay attention to, or that people have right in front of their faces and don't always appreciate for what they are. So we're going to definitely talk about some of those books that should be in the same breath as Watchmen, as Dark Knight Returns, as all those quote-unquote essential books, but don't necessarily get the credit for.
Exactly. I have one on my list that could arguably be done so, but I feel like I wanted to confirm it. Otherwise, I've definitely got a couple of randos on my list, and I know you do too.
Yeah.
So let's just go ahead and dive right into this. Again, we're talking about comics that we feel should be mentioned in the same breath as Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, Sandman, etc. So as always, before we kick off list proper, I do want to have some honorable mentions, and I think a couple of these honorable mentions are going to have some of y'all out there being like, how is that not on your actual list? All-Star Superman, Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely is an honorable mention. As amazing, I'm gonna come out right here and say, this is the Morrison podcast. We love Morrison. I sometimes wonder if Morrison may be a little bit too impenetrable to non-comics reading fans, and as much as All-Star Superman may be the best Superman story ever told, it's not something you can hand to a novice. I've tried to get my wife to read it. She can't get into it. It's beautiful. It's perfect, but I don't know if it's on this level. Same thing with Flex Mentallo. Again, Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely. Yeah. Love it, adore it, think it's amazing, as groundbreaking and redefining as something like Dark Knight Returns. Again, very much a piece of material about a piece of material that I think may not be the most accessible in the world. Avengers, Time Runs Out, from the tail end of the Jonathan Hickman run, the story that starts after the 8-month jump that leads into Secret War. Dude, I reread that this year in preparation for Jonathan Hickman's X-Men run, and it may be the best Marvel story of the 21st century so far. At least the best Avengers story.
Which I will say, for anybody who's been listening for a long time, finding great comic book Avenger stories is a fucking hard task. Because we did an episode, a couple years ago, about the best Avenger stories, and it was scouring through decades of Avengers comics, trying to find ones that we could even recommend, to be honest.
Exactly. And honestly, this was Time Runs Out was number 5 on my list for a long time for that exact reason, until I thought of one, again, that probably actually can be included in the same breath, but I just want to reaffirm it with this list. Justice League New Frontier was an honorable mention. Darwin Cook's masterpiece of DC fiction, and basically the only reason that's not on here is because I didn't want to put just Marvel and DC books, and I already had my DC book picked out, and our producer Lance is going to kill me. And my final honorable mention, Cerebus Volume 5, Jacka's story. Dave Sim at his best, both as a writer and a cartoonist. Gerard doing some tremendous stuff with the backgrounds. That was when Cerebus really came together and really was the book that everybody remembers Cerebus being. Unfortunately, Dave Sim has proven himself time and time and time and time and time again to be a horrible person for innumerable reasons, a tremendous misogynist, possibly a pedophile, and you just cannot separate the artist from the work when it comes to Dave Sim anymore. So
yeah,
I can't justify saying that everybody needs to read Cerebus in the same way that as much as I love Annie Hall, I can't recommend everybody go out and watch Annie Hall. I can't recommend everyone watch Rosemary's Baby. Sometimes the person is just such a horrific human being that it takes away from the enjoyment of the work.
Especially for something like Cerebus, which is so creator-owned and so focused from one viewpoint.
And so problematic anyway.
Yeah, like I'll be on
just on the page.
Like I'll say one of my honorable mentions equally has someone that's currently right now facing a lot of accusation stuff would be Superman American Alien. But I think because it's Superman, because there's such a big team behind it, it's easier to separate art from the artist in a situation like that than it is when it's like this is a character created for, and entirely written by pretty much this guy, and he has complete control.
Indelibly inseparable from him as a person and creator.
Especially kind of the later volumes. Well, all the volumes, but the later ones, very much a mouthpiece for a lot of his ideas.
Yeah, exactly. So having said all of that, my number 5, so it's really... Oh, I got one more. Civil War. Marvel Civil War is another honorable mention. Because, much like what I was about to say about my number 5, I desperately wish Marvel cared enough about their back catalog to care about having a book on a list like this. I wish they cared to have a book that they could have stand up and compete with Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns. And the closest thing that they got, and I feel like since the movies just made a couple $1 billion a piece, they'll finally keep Infinity Gauntlet in print and actually have it become this perennial seller, this perennial creation, this perennial story that people can go back to again and again and again. My number 5 is Infinity Gauntlet.
That makes sense, and I think is, especially in today's era, a very worthwhile pick. That is something that, looking back, has been so overlooked that it's crazy. The fact that even when me and you first became friends, the fact that even as a comics fan and someone who was into it, I hadn't read Infinity Gauntlet at that point in time. I didn't know the overall story. I knew it existed, and that was about it. And that was like right before the movies really... I mean, that was right before Avengers 1 came out.
Yeah, I remember that, yeah. And that was a time when, people... I remember people walking out of the theater being like, why is the Red Skull smiling in the post-credits of Avengers? And now, of course, Thanos is one of the most recognizable bad guys in the world. Everybody knows what the snap is. Everybody knows what the gauntlet is and what the gauntlet does. Jim Starlin deserves credit. He deserves recognition, and his work deserves to be in print in perpetuity. And again, hopefully the astounding, overwhelming success, both critically and financially, of movies based on his story will keep that to be the case.
I agree. I think that's a perfect pick, and one that really simplifies the purpose of the list, because that is something that I think is slowly becoming more and more accepted in the same breath as Watchmen, and importance, and especially knowing how much, like you mentioned, the fact that Marvel has always desperately wanted a Watchmen or Dark Knight Returns and hasn't realized until recently maybe they already had it.
Right, exactly.
It is crazy. It's very crazy. So I went with my list. We should mention that one of our kind of guidelines that you were hinting at is we went by the no Miller, no Morrison, no Gaiman, or no Moore route, because a lot of their books are already, for one, in the same breath as those, if they already didn't create those. We will kind of bend the rules a little bit here and there, but...
Oh, I totally broke it for my number 4. We'll get to that.
That's completely fine. But I want to say, because one of my big honorable mentions is Multiversity.
Multiversity was almost in my honorable mention, same reason, yeah.
Because I really think that'll... When we look back at comics, I think that will be in 20 years. Not only because of the effects it has had on other creators, whether it be Williamson and Snyder and Tynion and people like that, but just how well it explained, introduces, and really goes into depth on what the multiverse in DC is and how the entire DC universe is interconnected.
And what a shot in the arm for DC it was after the much critically reviled DCU, which, again, you and I, constant apologists for, but overall was a horrific death knell for DC. And then Multiversity came along, and everybody's like, oh, yeah, DC can actually do cool shit. Yeah. That's right.
So I definitely put up there, like I mentioned, American Alien, even though the accusations of Landis and all the crazy stuff that he's probably done and horrible shit. At the same time, I do think the ideas in that book, and because they're not so much, we mentioned with Sims, not so much not a mouthpiece, but more of an examination of the character of Superman, I can still recommend that book, and I think it's still a very worthwhile read, and there's so many great artists
I don't think I've told you this. I actually finally read Superman American Alien.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I bought it as part of a DC sale a little while back, and I read it. And you know me, I am not a fan of Max Landis as a person. I know that you're a big fan of his work. I was already not a fan of him as a person before a lot of the accusations started hitting a little bit more solidly. It's a pretty damn good Superman comic. Yeah. I wish I could separate the art from the artist in this case, because I think I would like it even more if I didn't know Max Landis' history. But even knowing it, I have to begrudgingly admit, it's a pretty damn good Superman comic.
It's one of those things we may never, especially now, may never get anything else from that series of books, from anything. But if you're just a pure Superman fan and want an interesting, different take on the Superman through the ages story, I would argue almost a modern version of Superman for 4 seasons? Or for all seasons?
I can see that. Superman for all seasons. Also, the fact that one issue is drawn by Nick Dragotta and another issue drawn by Joel Jones, that didn't hurt.
Yeah, that's one reason.
2 of my favorite working artists, that didn't hurt.
Yeah, that's definitely another reason I would say it's easier to separate. In something like a comic or a movie, it's easier because there's so many, or a comic like this, there's so many different hands involved in it that I can kind of like, well, this one part is problematic, but there's so many other parts that work their ass off on it too.
Right. Kind of like when Orson Scott Card had that 2-part Superman story that kicked off the Adventures of Superman digital comic. Yeah. Yeah, Orson Scott Card is the shit, but are you also? Yeah, it was. I remember that controversy as well, and it feels very similar.
Yeah. Anyway, less problematic or troublesome these days. Also, honorable mention, Mind Management Volume 1. I think that's a severely underrated comic. I think one of the coolest, most unique comics come out in the past 15 years that nobody talks about.
Agreed.
I remember even when I was when we were working at the shop together and showing it to you, I remember even though you weren't a huge fan, just the look and feel of that book was so different than everything at that time. So that's very high up there. And there's a few others that I could mention, but I'll just jump in the list. So on my number 5, it's a weird one, because I think much like you have to have, if you're a fan of movies, you can have appreciation for the Citizen Kanes, for the classics, for these amazing things, and in the same regard, love beautiful schlock like the Fast and Furious.
Absolutely, 100%. Yes.
I think in comics we need to be more accepting of the fun element of it. And more acceptable, like, hey, there's just as much importance in just dumb fun. And as weird as it is, my number 5 is Old Man Logan.
Nice. Okay, yeah.
It is, I think, the best equivalent of a major budget comic book B-movie, basically.
Yeah, and that Steve McNiven art really sells that idea of B-movie, I think. Yeah. Beautifully, grotesquely violent, but every page is captivating.
Yeah, it's captivating. It's a fun read. It's a quick read. It's a different take on the Marvel universe than we see in a lot of things for a lot of reasons. It's one of those things that even with Marvel getting all the rights back to all their properties, it is something that you will never see an exact shot-for-shot remake of for so many fucking reasons.
Yeah, exactly. Inbred Hulk, is just one thing that you will never actually... You would never put Mark Ruffalo through that.
No, yeah. Inbred Hulk, the entire Hulk incest family, just saying that, it might be, again, the closest B-movie. It is the freaking... If you want to watch, the weirdest spaghetti western meets The Hills Have Eyes. That's kind of Old Man Logan, and I also think it's something that if you're a fan of comics and just the fun of it, is in a weird way as important as a serious breaking down and retelling that Watchmen was. I think showing the world of, hey, this is fucking adult fun in a comic book and just lose yourself in the madness, I think that's equally in a way as important.
I gotta say, if you had to pick a mainstream superhero Mark Miller book that he worked on to give to, like you say, the masses, if this were 20 years ago, I'd say the Ultimates. But Marvel has proven they actually understand the Avengers better than Miller ever did. But yeah, Miller's Wolverine work, because Enemy of the State is pretty fucking good too.
Exactly. Like even his Ultimate X-Men, like him on X-Men was just he knew how to tell fun, big dumb movie version of X-Men and Wolverine like very few people do.
Agreed. And I can pivot off this really, really well.
Oh yeah, please do.
My number 4, if that's okay. Because my number 4, like I said, I cheated in that my number 4 is actually written by Frank Miller. It's drawn by Walter Simonson, one of the single best, most professional, tremendous artists of to span 2 decades. I mean, Ragnarok, Breaking of Helheim just came out a couple of weeks ago, so dude's still working today, and his work goes all the way back to the 1980s. The single best intercompany crossover comic, the single best comic based on a non-comics property, a licensed adaptation comic book. My number 4 is RoboCop versus Terminator.
I do love. We are going deep into like our just fun, weird action sci-fi kind of B-movie level. I kind of love that.
Yeah, exactly. And I loved so much what you were saying about Old Man Logan, because to me, that's what RoboCop versus Terminator is about. It's taking these movie concepts where, both of them, as beautiful and fantastic and wonderful as they are, Terminator and RoboCop are at their heart B movies, and they were made on a budget.
Yeah.
And when you blow up the budget like you can with a comic book and really do whatever you want with these ideas, and then you had Frank Miller, who actually weirdly has like a really deep understanding about RoboCop and the man versus machine mentality.
Yeah.
Frank Miller wrote RoboCop 2, or at least a draft of it, and has his name attached to the screenplay in the film. So, dude really knows his RoboCop. He manages to tie that into the origin of the Terminators, with Skynet accessing the same kind of AI that helped power RoboCop. There's tons of time travel hijinks in there. It's all just beautifully drawn, and everybody loves to credit oh my god, I'm blanking on the guy's name, Brian Hitch, for like his widescreen storytelling from The Authority and Ultimates. But I'd argue that before you had that kind of page-eating widescreen action from Brian Hitch, you had amazing widescreen action in traditional panel-to-panel continuity from Walter Simonson. It's a gorgeous book. It's hilarious. It's so much fun. I literally, at this point in my life, say there are 3 in-canon Terminator stories: Terminator, Terminator 2, and RoboCop versus Terminator. Everything else are just simulations run to keep Skynet like docile. It's a tremendous story, and the thing is, it came out during the 90s. And they overprinted the shit out of it, so you can easily find issues in the 50-cent dollar bins across the nation. It's a 4-issue miniseries, so easy to find. I bought the special edition hardcover from IDW or Dark Horse, whoever the hell put it out. I don't remember to this point, but it's in a stack of graphic novels on my floor here, and it's tremendous. I love it to death. It's goofy as shit, but I couldn't not put together a list like this and not mention this incredibly random but incredibly special intercompany crossover featuring licensed characters that shouldn't be half as good as it is, and it's one of the best comic books of the last 30 years. No,
I as someone who loves Frank Miller stuff, I think that's so underrated in his catalog and so underrated in comics in general. I think people just look at it as, it's like I said, it's an interconnected universe from different owned properties. It's just going to be some dumb, stupid 3-issue, 4-issue thing. Yeah, we'll just get over it and that's it. And no, it's so much more. In fact, the weird thing about it, there have been several cross-brand things that have turned out shockingly well in the past 20 years that people just ignore. I know you've talked about from some of the success of He-Man and Thundercats have had in recent years with DC crossovers.
All of the Batman Ninja Turtles that have come out from James Tynion and Freddie Williams II in the last couple of years have been spectacular.
Yeah.
The Judge Dredd Aliens Incubus miniseries, drawn by Henry Flint, who is a regular Judge Dredd artist, phenomenal.
Yeah, no, there's been some awesome shit out there. So don't, just because it's something that you think may be a little bit stupid, maybe give it a chance, because there's a lot of things out there in comics world that shouldn't work, but because it's in comics, somehow can work.
The Batman vs. Predator, the first one by Dave Gibbons and Andy Kubert, is pretty badass. That's from the 80s, but that's really worth your time. The Andy Kubert art in there is spectacular. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, it's fine. It's very true. A couple more quick honorable mentions before I completely move on to my number 4. I will, and this is one that will probably kind of shock because I know a lot of people would think this is on mine, but Batman Court of Owls. I think in a modern setting of redefining who Batman is, I think that will again be looked back on, and already kind of is like that is the definitive stepping stone for the modern Batman.
Agreed.
Then
for better or worse.
Yeah, exactly. And then Uncanny X-Force Dark Angel Saga, for similar reasons with the X-Men.
I was wondering if that was going to be on yours, because Apocalypse Solution nearly hit my honorable mentions.
It's like, if I could, it was like 5.5. It was on the list for so long. If I could have 6 spots, it would be number 6. It's so good, and because of the way the X-Men have been treated in recent years, so many great X books are overlooked from right before X-Men went to shit, and that's a prime example of one that all of Uncanny X-Force minus Otherworld is incredible. But I have had a grudge against that book for so long.
I remember.
It's not going anywhere. That grudge is staying. But anyway, to get to my actual number 4, also a book that came out around that same time, and one that does get a lot of credit, but I think as time goes on, should continue to get more and more and eventually be in that same category as Watchmen. Saga Volume 1.
I very nearly put Saga on here. I just couldn't figure out what volume I wanted to choose. I think Volume 1 is a great choice. And I'll tell you this, in all honesty, the first page of the first issue of Saga, I mean, I've said it before, it's quite possibly my favorite single opening page of a comic book.
It's one of that and Umbrella Academy are some of the only ones I can actually quote you. Am I shitting? Am I shitting? It feels like I'm shitting. Like, that whole thing is one of the few first pages I can actually quote in comics. Mm-hmm. Umbrella Academy would also be on honorable mentions, but that I mentioned that so much on this own podcast that I felt like I wanted to give some time to some other stuff.
That's totally fair. Totally fair. And
because of the show, that's also getting a lot of shine on it right now, so I'm okay with where that's at right now. So
that's fair.
Saga Volume 1, interdimensional space, weird Romeo and Juliet from the point of view of from a growing child from birth to a young age, ghost children, lying cats, robot men, sex cults, crazy stuff. It's a comic book that has everything and more, and also has a ton of heart, and is, I think, arguably, it's I don't know, this and Why Last Man being Brian K. Vaughan's like definitive, just incredible, proving why he should be known as one of the best writers ever.
Yeah, the only reason I put Y above it is because Saga went on an indefinite hiatus, ending on one of those famous Brian K. Vaughan cliffhangers.
Yeah.
At least Y got an ending, and with the more that happens with Vaughn, the more. I mean, they announced the hiatus was going to be at least a year. It's been a year, and we've heard nothing. And unfortunately, kind of like The Walking Dead, not announcing that the book was going away until the day the issue hit in the issue's letters pages, kind of screwed over retailers for. I mean, that was such a tremendous source of income and new readers for retailers, and then it disappearing off the markets kind of left them in a lurch. That doesn't decrease the power and strength of the comics that did come out. It's just it's kind of a bummer of an ending when you feel like there should be more of a triumphant end there. Still, yeah, those first 6 issues are magical.
Oh,
Agreed.
they really are.
And that Fiona.
Apples.
What's her last name? Yes. That's not her.
No, that's not. Sorry, that was a different Fiona Apple.
Yeah.
Yeah. Staples. Wait.
Staples. Yes. Fiona Staples' arc is. I remember I had a friend who literally works in animation. He works on the Warner Brothers lot, and he was telling me that there were artists, like working artists in comics, who are like, it's a really good thing Fiona Staples doesn't sell original artwork, because if she did, there would be no market. No one would buy original art because they'd all buy hers.
Yeah, no, that art is breathtakingly amazing. It is something that is, anytime you go back and look at it, it is so definitive and so unique to that book, especially. Like, it's an incredible book. That's one of the books I have recommended to more people over the years than almost anything else. I think that is, especially if you're talking about an entry-level book of, hey, pick this up and read it. That's perfect. It's also it was one of the first Image $9.99 volume 1s, and to this day it still is. And so it's still cheap as hell to go and get the first 6 issues.
Right, exactly. It's a tremendous entry point. I adore that book. Agreed, 100%.
So what is your number 3, sir?
My number 3 is probably I can almost guarantee you it's going to be the most recent one on this list, and I can also guarantee you that if you were to put together a list of comics you think Derek would put in this category, thank you for that update. I do not need a virus scan right now. You would probably guess that this was on there. You'd think it'd be hard to pick out a Tom King collection that I would put on the same level as something by Alan Moore, considering King's love of formalism echoes Moore's so heartily. But for me, it was actually really easy. My number 3 is Mr. Miracle.
Yeah, that does not shock me at all, but it's very very fitting and very good. It's like, well, it's a weird way it combines your love of Kirby, your love of King, and your appreciation for what Moore can do.
That pretty much sums it up. Yeah, it's Tom King is the first person since Grant Morrison to apparently have an idea and understanding of what Kirby was trying to go for with the Fourth World. Mm-hmm. He uses Miracle and Barda's relationship to explore his favorite themes, depression, fatherhood, growing old, trying to figure out who you are in the wake of life-changing distress, war, all of those things that, he has experienced as a CIA operative and as a human being, distilled so perfectly, a volume that has a ton of heart, a ton of humor. Big Barda is probably my favorite female character in comics, and he has such a tremendous grasp on her. Miss Gerens has a tremendous grasp on their relationship and how they need to be physically different. Barda needs to be so much larger than Miracle. It's Scott. It's the way he draws them, the way King writes their relationship, the way King handles Funky Flashman as both a loving tribute and mocking tribute at the same time to Stan Lee, softening some of those edges that Jack had during his run when he was actually still very angry at Lee. It's damn near a perfect comic. It succeeds on just about every level that it's trying to. I know the last issue put off certain people. It just made me love it even more. It's kind of a personal book for me too.
Yeah.
I really started dealing with my own depression about the time this was coming out, and that was definitely something that I kind of keyed into. So it's probably the most personal pick on my list, but also I think irregardless of that, I think it also earns this nomination.
No, I think even take away the personal aspect of it, I think it's very deserving, especially when you're looking at recent entries of the past 5 years. I think that's very deserving to be on a list like this. And actually goes well with mine because my next one's also very personal. And I will say, last honorable mention, I don't know why I wrote this on my list like this way of honorable mention and then the in-between stuff. I think because I would remember a book and they go, oh, that's not deserving, but it's good. Young Animal Milk Wars. I don't think you can't hand it to someone that is much like Flex Mentallo or other books. You can't hand it to someone that's not familiar with comics. It is such a small event about the comics industry and the negatives and positives of it that you cannot just give it to someone. It is the first time since Action Comics #9 from Grant Morrison that I think there's been such a just scathing review of the comics industry and at the same time appreciation for the same industry. It's amazing, incredible, but again, you cannot just hand it and be like, hey, read this and have a fuck what's going on.
Right.
It's crazy. But for my personal pick, and it's something I think that anyone can relate to, and speaking of dealing with depression, dealing with happiness, dealing with all emotions, the book I will always sing the praises of. My number 3 is Day Tripper.
I knew Day Tripper was going to be on your list, and honestly, I think I've realized I have a comic that means to me what Day Tripper means to you, and it's actually number 1 on my list, so I can't wait to talk about it.
I'm excited.
But I knew Day Tripper was going to be on yours. I wish I had read Day Tripper by now. I know how much it means to you, and I know how emotionally fraught it is as a comic, and that actually it's very hard for me to pick it up knowing that I'm going to be so emotionally touched by a comic, so it just sits there on the shelf staring at me.
Yeah, no, I don't blame you, because it's one of those things of, I know you're the same way, of someone who's been affected by death from a young age, and it's a book that really examines the meaning of life, the meaning of death, the celebration of both, and also the ups and downs of life from just different points of views. It's a story that I think could be adapted in like a Netflix series or something, but at the same time, it is such a story that Gabriel Ba and Fabio Moon do perfectly in the comics world. There's from exploring the relationships of family and friends, childhood, and tying them all together via death and how that affects those formerly mentioned. It's incredible. It's a surreal read. It's at times bizarre, at times crying out of joy, at times crying out of heartbreak. It is just such a comic you rarely get, where it's such a personal endeavor and you can feel the emotion in every word on every page. It is something that is rare in comics, since comics is so built on telling big grand stories. So many times you can hide that in subtext, you can hide the personal in between the lines, and this is one of the rare books that is wears it on its sleeve proudly, and I've always appreciated that. It's, again, as someone who loves Gabriel Ba and Fabio Moon, the artwork alone is worth it. It's just such a unique book, a great book, one that luckily keeps on over the years, kind of becoming a bigger and bigger cult hit, from going from paperback to hardback to finally getting an absolute, and becoming a bigger and bigger deal, and something I think over the years is going to be found out more and more for what it is. I think it was kind of looked over in its time as just a kind of pet project by the Casanova and Umbrella Academy guys, and now has become known as what it is, which is just this great, gripping tale.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm a little ashamed that I have not given it a shot yet, but it's also just I don't know if I'm in an emotional headspace where I can handle it. And again, I want to compare it to my number 1 pick here in a couple of choices. So I feel like I might talk about it a little bit more. I know you love it so much, and I wish I read it. Honestly,
it's something that I understand you need to be in the right headspace for it, because even though it's a book that I think can help work through pain and work through happiness, it's also something that if you're not, it can definitely rip open some wounds.
Yeah,
definitely.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
So I'm going to actually pivot a little bit on that one and go into something that is also a work that I feel like hits on some real raw emotion. But the real raw emotion that my number 2 pick hits on is righteous anger and Impotent Fury. My number 3, Transmetropolitan, Year of the Bastard. The third volume, the one where the Beast is defeated by the Smiler, despite the fact that Spider has crusaded against the Smiler. Oddly, I mean, it came out before the 2000 presidential election, but it feels like it weirdly echoed ahead to Clinton versus George W. It feels like it again has resonance today in the era of Trump. It's so unfortunate when a book about politics and the terrible things people do to each other because of hate and ignorance continues to be so vitally relevant as when it was written. It's frustrating. It makes you angry. It makes you upset. But it also conversely weirdly recharges those batteries. Because at least there's a catharsis in this. There's you get to see it happening to other people, and you get to see other people strengthen their resolve. And by having their resolve strengthened, you can feel your own strengthening. And that's what I feel like happens at the end of that volume with Spider and the two filthy assistants lobbing grenades at the city and basically being like, "Fuck you! I can't believe you did this." I love all of Transmetropolitan. I've talked about it before ad nauseum. I feel like as a very defining book for me as a person, and I feel like Year of the Bastard specifically is a very transcendental volume. It's a very important volume. So I wish people would talk more about Warren Ellis. I wish people would talk more about Derek Robertson. His name's coming up a little bit more lately because of The Boys, but it's a tremendous book. And again, weirdly, even though it's the third book in the Transmetropolitan series, I do feel like it's one that you could hand to somebody having not read the first two, because that's when the series starts congealing together into an actual narrative as opposed to a series of shorter stories.
Yeah, I think Transmetropolitan actually, it's one of those books that I think reads very well from most entry points. I mean, like, of course, if you come in at like the episode before the end of an arc, it's going to be hard. But if you start at the beginning of most volumes, from what I remember, they read pretty easy. Or at least easy as far as jumping into. They can be heady and can be hefty in a good way, but easy as jumping points.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to Warren Ellis as a writer.
Yeah.
He knew exactly how to shape his story arc so that you could, if you were somebody who was reading in the trades or just picked up a random trade, you could follow the story and then come into the story after that.
Yeah.
Again, also something I think Brian K. Vaughan was very good at with both Saga and Y.
I completely agree. So actually, my number two is kind of similar in that sense as far as a book that meant a lot to me personally. It wasn't so much an echoing of political stuff, but it was since the entire list was kind of built off of, what could we hand someone that, would be as impactful as Watchmen, would be as impactful as Dark Knight Returns, and also as easy to get into. The book that got me into reading weekly comics, and something that I think is, I talk much like Day Predator. I've sung its praises a bajillion times. It's legitimately my favorite Batman story, and I think the Batman story that is the best of the past 20 years, Batman Black Mirror. I love and adore it for so many reasons, but I also think it is the definitive Dick Grayson story as Batman. I think it's the definitive early 2010s Batman story, and I think it's something that is what would come. It's kind of the sound of punk to come for Batman comics. Of it has laid that blueprint. The rock that Court of Owls kind of became the foundation for Batman. This was kind of the blueprint for Batman to come.
I definitely agree with that. I don't have the affection for Black Mirror that you do, but I do own it. I do own a nice hardcover of it. I need to reread it because I remember being very fond of it. I think the biggest thing is you're a way bigger fan of Jock's artwork than I am.
Yeah, Jock's art is. I will say, for anyone out there who has a T-shirt of Joker made up of the bat, this is where that comes from. Because I see that artwork is everywhere, but I think a lot of people have no clue where it comes from.
Yeah, that was the cover in this run, right?
Yep, that was the singular Joker issue, which has one of my favorite Joker moments of all time, of Joker kind of echoing a little bit of Dark Knight Returns, of without Bruce Wayne, Joker kind of just being this weird, kind of almost comatose state, and Dick Grayson, Batman, trying to interrogate him, and the entire time it's like, you're not my bat. You're a bird of a different feather.
Yeah, like immediately knowing without knowing who they are, or as Snyder might later posit, without accepting who they are, immediately knowing that this bat is not the bat he's danced with so many times.
And also, not only doing that, but tying into some of my other favorite stories, like in a weird way, tying into stuff like Under the Red Hood, which also could arguably be on this list. In my opinion.
Personally, I remember the James Gordon Jr. stuff with the Francesco Francavilla who did the art?
Maybe. I can't remember off the top of my head. I should, but I can't.
The backup stories with Barbara Gordon and James Gordon Jr. That was, beautifully creepy and I think extremely well handled. Of course, I'm a huge Barbara Gordon fan. So having heard her father spotlighted.
Yeah, adding that layer to the entire Gordon family, adding this kind of under the surface level of, well, why does Barbara and Jim act like this? Why does it say? And then adding Junior to the mix of being like, oh, this is where a lot of this comes from. This is, and like you said, adding a more relatably creepy villain to the Batman mythos.
Right.
The serial killer next door, not to the Zaz level of like, oh, he's just, he's comic book creepy, but taking that horror roots of Snyder and go like, oh no, this guy is like fucking real life kind of creepy.
Yeah, there's a moment that will always stand out to me, and I kind of rank it on the same level as in the very first issue of Revival, when you have that old lady who keeps pulling out her teeth, but they keep growing back in, but she's kind of addled and is like, I wear dentures, I can't put my dentures in, I've got to pull the things out of my mouth that are keeping my dentures from going in, and she's actually physically pulling out her teeth. That is a scene from a comic that will always stay with me as just a holy shit, that is when I fell in love with this series. Yeah. The one from Black Mirror is where, Gordon Jr. is talking to his sister and just very calmly moves the blanket from her lap and shows that, oh, he's actually stabbed knives into her legs, and since she's paralyzed, she couldn't feel it. She had no idea. And it's just all very calmly and very quietly, and there's no yelling, there's no extravagance, there's no hyperbole to it. It's just a thing that he has done, and you're going to listen to me, because if you don't, I'll pull these out of your arteries and you're going to bleed out. Yeah. And it's such a perfect scene.
Well, and this going back to the core idea that Snyder's had since the beginning, that he's played with more than arguably anybody, and something that I love, and where Black Mirror gets its name, the idea that Gotham reflects its citizens and specifically reflects Batman, and the fact that he was able to, with Dick Grayson as Batman, change the Rogues Gallery, change how they interact with Batman, change the look of the city, change how the villains, how the heroes, everyone interacted, to me is such a unique and cool idea. And also, because of comics, we always talk about it, being in the second act. This is one of the few times in comics, because Bruce Wayne was bound to come back, and because he came back not long after this, this is kind of being this weird point in history where Dick Grayson was at the forefront, where he was Batman, and he had one of the main Batman stories, and it felt important, and it was the launching point to what would become a near decades-long story.
Right, agreed. You're really reminding me of the really good stuff in Black Mirror. I'm really gonna have to sit down and reread that.
Oh, thank you.
Before I get to my number one, I actually do have a couple more honorable mentions that I forgot to mention earlier. One that came really, really close is Batwoman Elegy.
Yes.
The collection of the Greg Rucka Batwoman, or James Williams III.
Yes.
Their Batwoman stuff came really super close.
Even like
Rucka writing strong female characters, and then Williams III drawing them. How could you go wrong?
Yeah, and even the first volume of the New 52 Batwoman that Williams III. I think that was just him on the first volume. I think.
Yeah, he wrote and drew the entire thing, while their own story.
Yeah, that first volume too is if you get, especially with the Batwoman TV show coming out, if you guys are looking for something, those two volumes, seek them out immediately, because those are incredible Batwoman stories.
Agreed. And my other final honorable mention, and really the only reason it's an honorable mention, is because I set the rule that we had to pick a specific graphic novel and not a collected edition. Bone.
Oh yeah.
And I couldn't justify being like, if you're going to put an Invisibles volume on there, you have to tell me which Invisibles volume, but I'm going to put the entirety of Bone. I couldn't do that. But, Bone would definitely be an honorable mention. But my number one pick, the number one comic that I genuinely think needs to be mentioned in the same breath as Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, is a book that I went into. Everyone told me, you're going to cry when you read this comic. And I went in knowing that. And this is one of the reasons I have such a hard time, with the idea of picking up Day Tripper, because I knew going in that I was not going to cry reading this comic. I was not going to let this comic emotionally affect me. I do not like comics where the protagonist is a 12-year-old girl. This is not a comic written for me. I am going to be totally okay. I'm going to read this just to prove that I have, I can do this. I'm going to beat the odds. Started crying halfway through issue 3, cried through the entirety of the rest of the book. It's a 5-issue collection. My number 1 is I Killed Giants.
That makes sense. I just want to phrase people: the Giants may not be real, as a fair warning, because that ruined the movie for me.
That's definitely more of a. I was gonna say that's more of a movie conceit.
Yeah.
In the comic, it's also in the comic where the Giants may or may not be reflections of emotional pain, but they may be giants that are also reflection of emotional pain in the comic, and I think that's a cooler idea. I've never been so completely emotionally just slapped in the taint by a comic as I was. I Killed Giants, and I have a hard time even thinking about going back and reading it, but I kind of want to, because it is such an emotional journey. The art is spectacular, and I wish I knew who the artist was. I cannot think of it, and I only have a digital copy, so I can't look at it up real quick. But he has such an interesting thing where he puts a lot of stuff. The way he angles it is very flat, but he handles perspective in such a fascinating way that it creates really interesting, like almost illusion of space on the page. It's very hard to describe, but it's an incredibly unique art style that I've literally never seen in a single other comic. And then Joe Kelly, who is a comic writer I really, really like. I love Joe Kelly's superhero stuff. But yeah, he captures the emotions of this kind of bitter, kind of cynical 12-year-old girl, and you find out over the course of the story, no spoilers, why she is kind of bitter and cynical, and what the giants that she's trying to fight, both real and metaphorical. And it means everything to me that Day Tripper does to you on a level of emotion and sentimentality and triumph and joy and tears and sorrow and coming to terms with loss and guilt, which is of course one of my big triggers. It's a tremendous read, and it snuck up on me. I never expected it to have the impact that it did, and that is why I had to put it at my number 1.
I need to read it. I made the mistake of watching the movie. I made the mistake of watching the movie first. And normally
I bought the movie. I still haven't watched it yet because of what you said about the movie.
It's not bad. It's not a bad movie. It had so much of the Bridget Terabithia vibe in the movie, at least.
Ooh, yeah. See, that's not something the comic does for sure.
Yeah, and see, I love Bridget Terabithia, but it's one of those things like I want something different. I need to read the comic. I will one day. That'll be on my list of things to read. We went very different directions, by the way, with our number 1.
Interesting. I can't wait to hear your number 1. I genuinely thought Day Tripper was going to be your number 1. I thought we were going to have a really emotional discussion, but I'm really glad that we've kind of actually separated it out a little bit. There
is one collected story that I think in every way deserves to be talked with Watchmen, in every way deserves to be talked with Dark Knight. I think it is in every way as influential, just in a weirder, more subtle way, and a book that is getting to that point now finally, but it's taken decades upon decades. Number 1 is Ian Call.
Yes. Oh my God. How did I not even think about Mobius? Yes.
Yeah, Alejandro Jodorowsky, Mobius, combining these crazy sci-fi ideas with spiritualism, with different religions, having this look of comics that is somehow tied to the past while looking at the future, ahead of its time in literally every way. If you want to know where people like Grant Morrison got a lot of the foundation for some of their ideas, where people like the Gaimans and Moores were kind of like, before they were really pushing, the people that were making movies and books and comics that were influencing their work, and going into the entire Jodorowsky library of work, from his comics to his movies. I think the Ian Call is kind of one of those doorways to a rabbit hole that you may not be ready for, but I think is as important as Watchmen I don't think in a more important way, because Watchmen, I think, for a lot of people, can have kind of a negative effect, where I think something like the Ian Call can actually lead you on a weird spiritual journey, but may get you to a different place in yourself, where I think Watchmen can just not to sound rude, but Watchmen can, in its deconstructive narrative, can kind of put people in a weird place when they look at other comics, where I think something like the In-Call can make you appreciate art in a whole new way.
Absolutely, and to add the list of creators who were influenced by it, I mean, even more modern creators like Brian Bendis and Matt Fraction have pointed out how much the In-Call influenced and inspired them. The thing is, the only thing I can say is I feel like the In-Call actually is a highly celebrated book. It's just as highly celebrated outside the United States.
Yes.
We as a culture are very insular with our comic books and our comics choices, and I feel like if you were to talk to somebody in France or Scotland or England about, comics of this caliber, the In-Call would come up in discussion pretty regularly. And it's such a bummer and such a shame that more Americans aren't aware of it and haven't had the experience with it. So, yeah, that's that American exceptionalism, despite the fact that Watchmen was written and drawn by British men, that American exceptionalism is very much a stumbling block for a book of power and creativity and of importance. Yeah. Excellent choice. That is the best way. I think that's the best way we can cap this show, because you're absolutely right. That is a book that not just deserves to be discussed in the same breath. It's a book that is discussed in the same breath from people who aren't us, and that needs to change. We need to be. We need to open our minds and our hearts to the creativity of the world outside of our own experiences.
Well, yeah, and I think that's one thing I've always appreciated about Jodorowsky's work in general is I think he might be the most easily penetrable expressionist in the terms of his comics, his movies. Yes, they're weird. Yes, they're fucking out there, but I think they are also understandable in a way that so many people have trouble making art in a similar way. Like, even whether it be the In-Call or Meta Barons or even weird ass shit like Holy Mountain and El Topo, there is something to them.
Screaming Planet.
Yes.
Which was a tremendous anthology series, yeah.
Yeah, there's something to them that he has this way of putting you on this crazy spiritual journey of these crazy out there ideas, but much like Morrison. So if anything, people listen to this podcast, you know how much we love Morrison. If you love Morrison and you have not read any Jodorowsky, do yourself a favor, pick up the In-Call, please. At least give the In-Call a chance.
And again, speaking of just, accessible, it's easily the most accessible, I feel like, of his work.
Oh, yeah.
And also, just random fact, a lot of the notes that Jodorowsky had for his Dune movie that went unmade went into the production of the In-Call. A lot of the ideas he wanted to explore in Dune ended up in the In-Call. So
he's talked about a lot.
It also has that weird Frank Herbert connection. Excuse me.
Yes, no, you're very much right. Like, that's another thing. Again, it is a straight up rabbit hole. Go watch Jodorowsky's Dune. About his movie that was,
which I still haven't seen. I need to see it.
It is one of my all time favorite documentaries. Just hearing him talk about, hearing how close they got to certain things, hearing that like a lot of these story elements went to the In-Call. A lot of the ship designs and character designs went to Meta Barons. A lot of that he kind of split up stuff. And if you look at everything that it sounds like crazy conspiracy stuff, but it's not. If you look at, because of Jodorowsky's Dune almost getting made, the team that he assembled were people that would later go on, and because they weren't able to make Dune, they took some of their designs, they took some ideas, and they'd go on to make Alien. They'd go on to make Star Wars. They'd go on to be involved in Star Trek shows in the future. They'd go on to be involved in all these things that kind of would literally infect and determine our view of sci-fi for the next till now. I mean,
literally, and I cannot believe I'm blanking on the guy's name. The guy that created the Alien, Geiger.
Oh yes,
Geiger was quite literally discovered because Jodorowsky brought him on to do production art for Dune.
Yes,
that is literally the reason Geiger was brought on to Alien, is because of 100% because of Jodorowsky's Dune. That's literally the reason. So, yeah,
it's
things you love from your life are directly, can be traced back to Jodorowsky in a tremendously, not even a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon way. It's a fucking straight line.
Yeah, it's one of those crazy things of where it's equivalent of finding that band, finding that artist where you can trace all these different influences that you love, and you can trace them down to people. Jodorowsky is one of those rare people where it's kind of like, we can trace a lot of people we love to Grant Morrison. If you follow that train back just one more stop, you get Jodorowsky. And that is the easiest place to dive into so much. Even a lot of the books we talk about on this very particular podcast are ones that were in some way influenced by people who love Jodorowsky's work. And yeah, I think that's a good place to kind of end this on. Of all these books, go and read if you have a chance. But stuff like if you're looking for a personal story, if you're looking for something to really, that you're needing to work through some personal stuff like I Kill Giants and Day Tripper are incredible. If you're looking for great superhero stories, we gave you some incredible ones. But if you're looking for just a book that on every level is up there with Watchmen and that, then yeah, for sure the In-Call. And
yeah. I rarely say this on just a list podcast, but you won the podcast, man.
Thank you. That was the one I was literally like looking at my shelves, and that was one I even passed over a couple times. But then I realized, like you said, even though I know we hold it to such a regard, and a lot of, I hate saying it this way, but deeper cut comics fans hold it such a regard, I still know there are so few people that know the In-Call exists even. And
exists, yeah, exactly.
That is something that needs to change, because it is something that is a very important step. If you're a fan of the history of comics even, it is a very important stepping stone to comics as we know it. And it does not get the love that it should, especially here in America.
Absolutely. And on that note, we want to know what you think. Have you read The In-Call? What do you think about it? Are you a fan of RoboCop versus Terminator or Old Man Logan? Let us know. There are so many ways you can get a hold of us. You can shoot us an email at blah blah podcast.
I love that we have Old Man Logan, RoboCop versus Terminator on the same list as stuff like The In-Call. That I love that about our podcast.
Exactly. Same here. It's 100% yes. I feel like that sets us apart from some of your more average podcasts.
Yes.
But tell us what you think about these kinds of various things of quality being on our podcast at blahblahpodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/blahblahpodcast. You can find us on Instagram, where I mostly just post pieces of writing that I've done at blah blah podcast, or you can find us on Twitter, where I am at blah blah pod,
and I'm at Hellhound F5.
And we love to talk to you. Thank you so much for listening to this show. It was a blast to do. Next week we'll probably have more of a comics review. We'll have a couple more issues of Hickman's House of X Powers of 10 out to talk about. Maybe more stuff on that. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the Scott Snyder, Greg Capullo rumor mill that kind of got hinted at on Twitter this week. But it'll be fun. Join us next week. And again, thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, everybody. So long and good night.
Blah Blah Comics.